Hi everyone. Today we're going to get into our first book of the semester, looking at the theory of the leisure class by Thorstein Veblen. So Veblen is an American theorist, and we're going to go back to the middle years and of what we've been doing so far in this section of the class. So just kind of keep in mind, within this middle year American social theory, again, is that kind of a refocus of attention to the individual level. And with that refocus on the individual, we have a heightened awareness of agency, of free will, compared to the classical theorists, kind of the earlier part of our class. And also, we started to see was that pattern of psychological tension being a driving force in the theories. For Du Bois, it's that psychological tension that causes that second consciousness to emerge. For Cooley and Mead, we try to match our identities, our actions to expectations of self, expectations of how we're supposed to act. And again, the psychological tension is kind of driving that match, because when there's a mismatch between kind of what we're expected to do or who we are and who we're expected to be and what we actually do, and then you start to develop that tension, that psychological uneasiness. So with Vemlen, we kind of get away from that specific focus on psychological tension. He's an American theorist during this time period, but he's not necessarily carrying on the tradition of Cooley and Mead, like we saw in the Adlers, like we see in Du Bois as well. For the most part, we can say he's unique in this time period because, as kind of American theorist, he does focus on the individual, kind of the social psychological being, but also he focuses on how all that operates within modern society. So here we're kind of going back to uh, Weber, going back to Marx, and we'll focus on kind of modernity as kind of the emergence of capitalism and the emergence of urbanization, kind of reorganizing how people live. And that's important for Veblen in terms of his theory about kind of status and people trying to display status in various ways. So again, we'll focus on the individual like we've been doing, individual thoughts, individual actions. But for Veblen, it's kind of within a larger framework of recognizing the role of capitalism, of modern society, and that includes urban spaces as well. So before we get into this beginning of the book today, what I wanted to do is spend a few minutes on the report guidelines. So basically, we have our smaller papers. I'm trying to get you to kind of see, the what's and the how, and kind of connect the dots to different things as well. Here with the larger paper, I'm really getting you to think about the inner workings, the dynamics of the theories in terms of structured agency, in terms of what is that driving force, and in terms of the directional focus. Is it kind of a top-down focus, a macro, or more of a bottom-up focus, micro? And it's not always going to be one or the other. They're going to be kind of in relation to one another. So there's a macro focus that kind of ends up on the micro level, or there's a micro focus that kind of builds up to a more macro level. Likewise, it's not going to be all structure and agency. There's going to be kind of interplay between the two. So, that's kind of the heart of your paper. And that's what we see in these guidelines before us now. Basically, I ask you to write 4 full pages, double spaced. And as you're writing, you must kind of cite the book, use the text to support your ideas, to build your arguments. And so the beginning of the paper is basically a summary. So here we're looking at kind of a paragraph or two. And, I like to think about a summary as you're explaining the main ideas of the book to someone who hasn't read it yet. So, a roommate to yours, a family member, and they may be curious, what are you doing right now in your theory class? And you say, oh, I just finished this book. And then you kind of, briefly describe the book for them as to get the main ideas across. So that's how you should approach the summary. Just think about briefly explaining the key ideas of the book to someone who's never read it before. And then kind of going down from the summary, we start to get more specific. And here I ask you to do three different things. And here we're looking at kind of those interworkings I just mentioned. First, what is that driving force in the framework? Why are people kind of doing what they're doing and perhaps not doing something else? So we'll talk about that today, kind of from the get-go. We'll identify that driving force for Veblen. And then we get into two examples between structure and agency. So, what are two examples of this relationship going on? How agency is being practiced kind of in response to a structure, or how kind of a structure is kind of confining, structuring one's behaviors. So basically, I'm asking you to identify two different examples of this connection between structure and agency in the book. And then finally, you talk about, what is the interplay between the macro and micro levels. And so I think Veblen does a good job of kind of going back and forth. So basically, you want to kind of identify that. Here we see more of a focus, from the top down. On the other hand, we see here he focuses more on the micro level. So again, it's not going to be all one or the other, but you kind of just identify that interplay, the relationship between the macro focus and the micro focus in the book. So, this part of the paper is the most difficult part. And here is where students kind of separate themselves from other students. You either getting the majority of the points here and typically go on to do well the rest of the paper, or this is where you lose a lot of your points because you kind of struggle to identify and to kind of express what's going on in terms of these interworkings of theory. And so the rest of the paper, relatively speaking, is easier, I think. Usually, if you're just explaining your thoughts fully and doing what I'm asking you to do, you should get the majority, if not all the points for kind of the last part of the paper. And so here I ask you to compare, contrast with two previous course theories. So basically, think about how it's similar or how it's different compared to earlier theories in the class. And again, just make sure that when you're identifying the similarities or differences, you're clearly explaining what they are. So don't assume that I know what you're talking about. So, try to, again, write it as you would for somebody who hasn't, read any of this stuff yet. So you need to fully kind of explain the similarity or explain the difference to the previous theories. And then the next part, basically, I'm asking you to take these ideas that we'll be talking about in the book and relate them to life today. So, how can we relate the book to what's going on in our lives, at a local level, our personal lives, or maybe at a more national level or on a global level? And I don't think that should be too difficult to do because, a lot of what we'll get into, to me, is pretty interesting and looking at kind of how people practice social status. And so finally, the last part of the paper is asking you about what you would add or change about the theory. So what would you add to it to make it a better theory? What would you maybe change or take away from it? And in doing so, again, you would think you'd be making it a better theory. So again, just as long as you're fully explaining, what you're doing, why you're doing it, you should be good to go with this last section of the paper. So we'll come back to this, as we move forward throughout the book. But I just wanted to kind of get it out there and then briefly kind of touch on, what you're being asked to do in the paper and how to approach it, mentally speaking. So looking at the theory of the leisure class, here we're looking at a theory of social stratification. So a new type of kind of general theme, rather than looking at, social control or, self-change, or we're looking at a theory of social stratification, and basically the creation of a social hierarchy, kind of that vertical ordering based upon status that, Weber talked about a little bit, and specifically kind of within this time period of modernity. And again, we're kind of taking it up a notch to that more of a macro level when we say, looking at social stratification, group kind of orderings. But again, we'll be taking it down to the micro level when the focus becomes primarily on kind of people, how they think, how they act, and kind of the motivations behind those thoughts and actions. So that's what we're looking at, theory of social stratification. Basically, he's examining how we create this kind of social hierarchy, this vertical ordering of status in modern society. And so basically, the what and what he's trying to explain, he explains that class distinction forms in modern society are different compared to how you would separate people in the past. And so again, modern society, when we think of the influence of capitalism, kind of reorganizing life, and the influence of urbanization, reorganizing life as well. And so we'll get into those elements a little bit later. So nevertheless, so looking at class distinction forms, basically these social orderings in a vertical manner. And he says, people, so here we get into kind of that driving force. According to Veblen, people have these instinctual desires to compete against other people. So basically, we have these instinctual desires to compete, to kind of, dominate other people, to kind of put ourselves above them in that vertical ordering. And these desires to compete always exist, so you'll see them in every time period, but they'll exist differently according to the time period in which they're experienced. So, in the book, being the book, he talks about, a lot of kind of earlier forms of competition had to do with kind of, physical competition. So that's how you would kind of outdo other people. It'd be through, physical battles, whether it be kind of a one-on-one nature or more group battles. And that was more kind of part of the past, older histories. And again, based upon kind of how you organize society, how you lived your lives in those past periods. Today, in more modern society, we still have that desire to compete. We still have that desire to kind of one-up us over other people, but we express that desire differently. And so basically we can say that, the game is always there, but how you play the game in terms of dominating others, creating that social stratification changes from history to history. In new histories, you have new methods of doing things, and new histories, you have new weapons to compete with one another. So again, we're kind of putting down the weapons of war and battle, and now we're picking up kind of new weapons that are a reflection of our capitalist system and living in more urban environments compared to rural environments. So here we get into kind of unpacking a little bit more. So he's trying to explain, class distinction, social stratification in modern society. And he says, people have this instinctual desire to create this ordering, to kind of outdo other people. And it's expressed differently according to the history in which you live. And in modernity and modern society, what we start to see are two new classes emerging. So this is, similar to how Weber, how Marx talked about social class. You had kind of the owners and the workers. And for Veblen, he calls the owners the leisure class. Basically, those who are not producing anything, but basically are kind of sitting back and letting other people do the production. And those who are doing the production, those who are doing the actual work, are the working class. So in modernity, we have these two new classes that emerge, the capitalists, the leisure class, and then the workers, those who work for wages. And so we look at how we can say social and self-esteem are both derived from comparisons. So, we have this kind of instinctual desire to kind of outdo other people. And, how this works is you have to kind of compare yourself to them. So again, because they're not really doing the physical battles anymore, it's more a symbolic level, what we start to get into more so in our next class. And we start to kind of see other people in relation to other people in terms of, this ranking. And so if you compare two different groups or two different people to one another, you'll create that vertical ranking. And so kind of you'll give them that social esteem, and that you'll give them prestige or you don't give them the prestige, you stigmatize them if they tend to fall on the bottom. And then also we do this for ourselves. So we compare ourselves to other people and we'll feel good when we're kind of at the top, or maybe we don't feel so good when the other people kind of outrank us. So nevertheless, you see this going on, and Veblen believes that we have a tendency to practice upward comparisons more than downward. So, this is kind of, a bad thing if you think about it, because when you're focusing on always, who's better than you, it kind of creates that, psychological tension, so to speak. And when you're always comparing yourselves to others, you always want to kind of do more to kind of outdo them. So you're never content. You're never kind of happy because there's always somebody who is above you. And when you use them as a comparison, as a reference group, and then you want to continue to kind of do what you're doing to get to their level, or surpass them eventually. And he actually says that basically, the working class, they compare themselves to other workers, and they compare themselves to the upper classes as well. But he says the upper class, the leisure class, this basically ignores the working class. They don't give them any mind. They don't pay attention to them at all. They just do the comparisons kind of among themselves. So, this, something to throw in there in terms of the comparisons and how that works. So basically, how you kind of recognize yourself in relation to others, how you recognize other people in relation to other people, and that will kind of give you those evaluations of your of your self-worth as a whole. So in modern society, what we're basically using as the measurements reflects, the capitalist system. Again, kind of going back to Weber, where class matters the most in a capitalist system, compared to in feudalism or slavery. It was more about your status, or it was more about your party. In a capitalist system, although status and party matter still, in a capitalist system, class matters. And so we start to recognize that and use it as a measuring stick to kind of place people in that vertical ordering. So possession of property and possession of wealth become the basis on which these comparisons occur. And so, it's problematic because, in the past, when basically you kind of knew somebody's last name, or you kind of understood kind of, what they did, you knew their status. But now in a more modern society, there's two things kind of working against you in terms of doing these social comparisons. On the one hand, in a capitalist system where property and wealth are used as measuring sticks, you can't tell somebody's property or wealth by looking at them. We don't walk around with our bank account statements, on our chest, or how much property we own. That's not visible. So it's hard to tell, somebody's social position when you can't tell, what's in their bank account, what, how many assets do they own. And so it's problematic because you can't tell them, but it's also considered to be impolite, rude to ask people that information. So you're not supposed to, really discuss money. And so that becomes kind of the other rub. You can't tell it from looking at somebody, and it's impolite to ask people about their wealth, about their property. So that's kind of throws the wrench into the thing. And so people have to come up with other ways to display their wealth, other ways to read the wealth of other people. And that's where kind of the battles are no longer physical, but now the battles become symbolic. And we'll get into that as we start to kind of get through the rest of the book. So that's kind of one rub, but again, bring in the role of urban society as well. In a rural area, when it's a very small town, people do know other people. So eventually you do learn kind of the class position of other people, because everybody knows everybody's business. But in a more urbanized society, people are more likely to be strangers with one another, and you don't know strangers, what they're about, who they are. Thus, you don't know kind of their class standing. So capitalist system where money becomes the most important thing, and you can't tell by looking at somebody what their money situation is. The urban environment, where you no longer kind of know people as well compared to the rural kind of pre-modern era. And this new history in which we're living creates the new ways of kind of practicing social status. And that's what we'll turn our attention to and when we get together for our next class. So just a little bit of introduction today, kind of the general type of theory and kind of what he's explaining, then beginning to unpack how he's explaining it and really start to get into the heart of the theory at our next reading. So I'll leave that there for today. As always, if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll kind of start to focus on the book in terms of the what, how, and why. But I'll make sure to kind of revisit these ideas too in reference to the book report, what I'm asking you to do for your assignment. So I'll leave that there, and I'll see you next time.